The American airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities in June 2025 did not occur in a vacuum. To truly understand this perilous moment, one must look back over a century of foreign intervention, broken promises, and simmering grievances that have defined the modern Middle East. The region's current borders and conflicts are, in many ways, a direct inheritance from colonial powers. The 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret pact between Britain and France, carved up the Ottoman Empire with little regard for the ethnic, religious, and tribal realities on the ground. This act of imperial arrogance laid the foundation for decades of instability, creating artificial states and fueling a deep-seated resentment against Western powers that persists to this day. This history of external manipulation continued with the 1917 Balfour Declaration, in which Britain endorsed the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. While the aspirations for a Jewish homeland were understandable in the wake of centuries of persecution, the declaration largely ignored the rights and aspirations of the existing Arab population. The subsequent creation of the State of Israel in 1948 following the Holocaust led to the displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians in what they call the Nakba, or catastrophe. This event triggered a series of wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors, cementing a central conflict that has rippled across the region for over 75 years, creating wounds that have never healed. After World War II, the United States emerged as the dominant external power, its influence deeply intertwined with the region's vast oil reserves. American foreign policy, often driven by Cold War calculations and the pursuit of energy security, frequently supported authoritarian regimes over democratic movements. A pivotal moment came in 1953, when the CIA orchestrated a coup in Iran to overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized the country's oil industry. This intervention installed the Shah, whose repressive rule ultimately led to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which brought a fiercely anti-American clerical regime to power and set the stage for the enduring animosity between Washington and Tehran. Further U.S. actions, such as the 2003 invasion of Iraq, profoundly reshaped the regional balance of power. The toppling of Saddam Hussein, a Sunni dictator and a bitter rival of Iran, created a power vacuum that Tehran skillfully exploited. By supporting Shia militias and political parties in Iraq, Iran extended its influence westward, creating a Shia crescent or axis of resistance that stretches from Tehran to Beirut. This expansion of Iranian power directly threatened American allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia, turning a complex web of historical grievances into a direct geopolitical contest for dominance that has now reached a terrifying, new, and direct phase of conflict. For decades, the rivalry between Iran and Israel was a shadow war, a deadly but indirect struggle fought through covert operations, cyber attacks, and most visibly, proxy forces. Iran armed and funded groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, using them to bleed its adversary without risking a direct state-to-state war. Israel, in turn, conducted assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists and launched clandestine strikes against Iranian military assets in Syria. This dangerous equilibrium, however, was always fragile. It allowed both sides to claim victories and project strength while maintaining a veneer of deniability, but it steadily raised the stakes, making a direct confrontation almost inevitable over the long run. That fragile balance shattered spectacularly in April 2024, in response to a suspected Israeli airstrike that killed a top Iranian general at a consulate in Damascus. Iran took an unprecedented step. It launched a massive, direct assault on Israel, firing over 300 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. While the attack was largely thwarted by a coordinated defense involving Israel, the US, and other allies, its significance was immense. It marked the first time Iran had attacked Israel directly from its own soil, crossing a critical red line. The era of shadows was over. The conflict was now out in the open, forcing a direct and public response from Israel, which retaliated with its own strikes deep inside Iran. This escalation created a new and far more dangerous strategic reality. The unwritten rules of engagement had been torn up. Both nations had demonstrated a willingness to strike each other's territory directly, raising the frightening prospect of a full-scale regional war. The events of April 2024 set the stage for the crisis that unfolded just over a year later. For policymakers in Washington and Jerusalem, the direct Iranian attack was seen as proof of Tehran's increasing boldness, and a sign that its pursuit of nuclear capability could no longer be managed through sanctions and diplomacy alone. The perception grew that Iran, feeling emboldened, might race toward a bomb, believing it could deter any meaningful response. The diplomatic track, already on life support for years, completely collapsed in the aftermath. Hardliners in both Tehran and Jerusalem felt vindicated, their arguments for military preemption gaining traction. In Washington, the Trump administration, which had long advocated a more confrontational stance, saw the April escalation as a final justification for decisive action. The stage was meticulously set for the U.S. to abandon its long-standing policy of strategic ambiguity regarding a military strike. The Shadow War's end had not brought clarity or deterrence. Instead, it had paved a direct path toward the American bombs that fell on Iran's nuclear sites in June 2025. In the early hours of a June morning in 2025, the world watched as the United States executed its most direct military action against Iran in history. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers flying from distant bases unleashed massive 30,000-pound bunker-buster bombs on Iran's heavily fortified underground nuclear facilities at Fordow and Natanz. The strikes were supplemented by Tomahawk cruise missiles targeting infrastructure at the Isfahan nuclear complex. The official justification articulated by President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio was clear and urgent. The attack was a preemptive act of self-defense, designed to prevent Iran from achieving nuclear breakout capability. The administration cited fresh, urgent intelligence suggesting Iran was on the verge of producing weapons-grade uranium. The White House also framed the strikes as a necessary step to prevent a more chaotic, unilateral attack by Israel. The argument was that a controlled, precise American operation was preferable to a potentially wider and more indiscriminate Israeli campaign that could have dragged the entire region into war. In public statements, administration officials like Special Envoy Steve Witkoff declared the mission an overwhelming success, claiming the targeted sites were obliterated and Iran's nuclear ambitions set back by many years. This narrative was designed to project strength and decisiveness, reassuring allies and deterring any immediate large-scale Iranian reprisal by showcasing overwhelming American power. However, this triumphant narrative was immediately challenged by leaks from within the U.S. intelligence community. A preliminary assessment from the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, painted a far less successful picture, concluding the strikes had only delayed Iran's program by less than 6 months. The report suggested that while above-ground structures were damaged, the core underground facilities were not breached, and that Iran had likely moved its most valuable enriched uranium in centrifuges to undisclosed locations prior to the attack. This created a jarring information war, pitting the administration's public claims against the sober, classified assessments of its own intelligence experts. Iran's reaction was swift and furious. State television declared the American attack a declaration of war, and Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei vowed severe vengeance. Mass protests erupted in Tehran, with crowds chanting "Death to America." In the immediate aftermath, Iran and Israel engaged in a 12-day exchange of fire that ended in a shaky ceasefire. Yet, Iran's leaders made it clear that their response was not over, threatening to retaliate against both American and Israeli targets across the region at a time and place of their choosing. The strikes, intended to eliminate a threat, had instead guaranteed a future of heightened tension and the near certainty of Iranian retaliation. The American strikes on Iran have pushed an already volatile Middle East to the absolute brink, creating 3 profound and interconnected risks that threaten global stability. The most immediate danger is a wider regional war. With Iran vowing revenge, tens of thousands of U.S. troops stationed across the Middle East are now potential targets. Iran's powerful network of proxies, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen and militias in Iraq, could be activated to launch a multi-front assault against American and Israeli interests. A retaliatory strike by Hezbollah on northern Israel, for instance, could trigger a devastating war that would dwarf previous conflicts and inevitably draw in the United States directly. The second major risk is to the global economy. Iran has repeatedly threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes. Even a temporary disruption of this critical choke point would cause oil prices to skyrocket, potentially triggering a global recession. The mere threat of closure has already sent jitters through financial markets, and any military escalation in the Persian Gulf would have catastrophic economic consequences. Nations like China and India, heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil, have called for de-escalation, aware that a regional conflict would severely damage their economies and create immense political pressure at home. Perhaps the most dangerous and ironic consequence of the strikes is that they may accelerate the very outcome they were meant to prevent: a nuclear-armed Iran. The attack has empowered hardliners in Tehran who have long argued that a nuclear weapon is the only ultimate guarantee of the regime's survival and the only effective deterrent against American or Israeli attack. For them, the US strikes are proof that diplomacy and compliance with international norms offer no real security. This has fueled calls for Iran to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, and pursue a bomb openly, potentially sparking a dangerous nuclear arms race across the Middle East, as countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey feel compelled to follow suit. Ultimately, the crisis of June 2025 is a powerful and tragic reminder of how the long arc of history continues to shape the present. The unresolved grievances from colonial line drawing, the displacement of the Palestinians, and decades of foreign intervention have created a landscape where trust is non-existent and conflict is the default state. The American strikes, born of a desire to enforce security, may have only deepened the cycle of violence. Finding a path to lasting peace requires more than military solutions. It demands a genuine reckoning with this troubled history and a willingness to pursue diplomacy, even when it seems most difficult. For now, the region and the world hold their breath, hoping to avoid the abyss.